The Christmas Star That Lost Its Way, a Miss Marple Mystery. Dear listeners, welcome to tonight's Miss Marple Mystery. I'm Frank, your host, and I'm thrilled to have you here for another captivating tale. Before we dive in, I'd love to hear a bit about you. What do you do? Or what did you do for a living? Maybe you're a chef, a gardener, an artist, or something wonderfully unique. Drop it in the comments. I always enjoy discovering more about our amazing community. Now, let's get cozy and start tonight's story. Chapter 1. The Village of St. Mary's Well. Nestled quietly under a heavy blanket of winter snow. From the warmth of their hearths, the residents of this picturesque little town went about their business. Their breath visible in the crisp air, wrapped in layers of wool and scarves. Christmas was just around the corner, and as usual, the festive spirit was palpable. Church bells rang, carolers sang, and the scent of roasting chestnuts filled the streets. Miss Marple, with her ever-watchful eyes and perceptive ear, sat by her window, looking out onto the village square. She had watched this village for many years, quiet years mostly. The villagers, who appeared to be good solid folk, were the sort who knew everyone else's business, but kept their own lives tightly bound. There were few secrets here, or so it seemed. But even the most peaceful of places had their skeletons tucked away, waiting for the right moment to tumble out. It was at Mrs. Winthrop's Christmas tea party that the first ripple of unease stirred the surface of the idyllic village life. Mrs. Winthrop, a woman who seemed to think that the seasons could not change without her guidance, had taken it upon herself to host the most lavish tea St. Mary's Well had seen in years. The large ivy-clad manor that she and her late husband had built stood at the heart of the village, and it was a familiar sight, always beautifully decorated as if awaiting a royal inspection. The guests were no different. The villagers had been invited with the usual fanfare, each one feeling it was their duty to attend. Miss Marple arrived punctually, her steps muffled by the snow. She was an old woman, bent with age, yet there was something in her that held a sharpness, the precision of one who had spent years observing the world and its people. She took a seat in the drawing-room where the guests were already milling about, exchanging pleasantries. As usual, there was an air of civility here, but Miss Marple's eye could see beyond it. There was a tension, slight perhaps, but there all the same. Mr. Andrews, the local solicitor, was speaking to Mrs. Winthrop in a low tone, his face flushed as though he had been arguing. Miss Marple, who had always found Mr. Andrews's voice a bit too loud, was attentive to the way Mrs. Winthrop fidgeted, adjusting her brooch nervously. They were no longer the only ones with heightened attention. A few others had noticed too, but no one spoke a word. Mrs. Winthrop ushered Miss Marple in with her usual graciousness, but there was something in her smile, a nervous twitch, perhaps, that Miss Marple didn't miss. As she took her seat, Miss Marple observed the room closely. There were a few new faces, visitors no doubt, but nothing too remarkable. There was, however, something in the air that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was a look between Mrs. Winthrop and her daughter Grace. The young woman, who had been as bubbly and charming as a summer's day at one time, now looked pale, drawn as though she carried a heavy secret. Grace was standing by the window, staring out at the snow. Her fingers tapped nervously on the edge of her teacup. Miss Marple let her gaze drift over to the far corner of the room, where the village's local vicar, Reverend Pendleton was in conversation with Miss Lambert, a widow with a reputation for excessive gossip. Pendleton's voice was low, and he seemed uneasy. Miss Lambert, as always, spoke loudly, her laugh ringing like a bell. A few of the others had gathered around them, but none seemed particularly at ease. Then there was the matter of the clock on the mantelpiece. The hands had stopped moving. Not an unusual thing, Miss Marple thought. Time, it seemed, had chosen this particular moment to freeze. A simple malfunction, nothing more. But she didn't believe in coincidences. A sudden, sharp scream pierced the otherwise contented chatter of the room, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Miss Marple was already standing. Grace Winthrop had collapsed, her face ashen. Her mother was at her side in an instant, but it was clear that her daughter was unconscious, her breath shallow. The guests scrambled in confusion, but Miss Marple moved through the crowd, her old legs not slowing her down. She knelt beside Grace and noticed immediately the faint scent of almonds in the air. A subtle fragrance, almost masked by the mingling smells of tea and Christmas spices, but unmistakable to one who had lived a long life full of ordinary people hiding extraordinary secrets. It wasn't a sudden shock that had caused Grace to faint. No, it was something far more dangerous. A dose of poison. There were gasps and murmurs, but Miss Marple's sharp eyes remained focused on the task at hand. She gently placed her hand over Grace's wrist, feeling the pulse, her mind already working through the possibilities. For now she said nothing, but inside, the pieces were already starting to come together. A party that had started with so much promise was now tangled in something far darker. And Miss Marple would find the answer, just as she always did. Chapter 2. The snow continued to fall outside, soft and persistent, as the guests in Mrs. Winthrop's drawing room gathered their wits. The shock of Grace Winthrop's sudden collapse had left the air thick with tension, and Miss Marple remained at her side, her keen eyes never leaving the young woman. The faint scent of almonds lingered in the air, a detail that to others might have gone unnoticed amidst the confusion. But Miss Marple, ever the observer, was already piecing things together. Mrs. Winthrop, her face pale and taut with worry, clutched her daughter's hand as the local doctor, Dr. Hawkins, rushed into the room. He had been summoned immediately, and there was no time to waste. His first actions were to check Grace's pulse and breathe, but it was clear that Grace was no longer merely faint. There was something more sinister at play. "Poison," Miss Marple murmured under her breath, just loud enough for the vicar, Reverend Pendleton, to overhear. He gave her a sidelong glance, but said nothing. His usual air of calm authority had faltered for a moment, and Miss Marple noticed his eyes shifting from the unconscious Grace to the shattered glass on the floor. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low, almost too calm. But Miss Marple knew that tone. It was the one people used when they were trying to hide their concern. "Grace must have drunk from the wrong glass," Miss Marple said simply, but her eyes remained fixed on the scene unfolding before her. Dr. Hawkins leaned in, his hand steady despite the gravity of the situation. "What was in the glass?" he asked the room, though he knew as well as anyone that it was not a simple matter of spilled wine or a forgotten cocktail. The delicate scent of almonds was unmistakable now, a faint hint of cyanide. Miss Marple could hear the whispers around her. The other guests were beginning to look at one another, exchanging confused glances. Mrs. Winthrop had taken Grace's collapse in stride, but Miss Marple could tell that behind her measured composure there was an undercurrent of dread. "I'll see to her," Dr. Hawkins said, his tone softening as he looked up at Mrs. Winthrop. "We need to move quickly. I suspect poison, but the amount is still unclear. There's time, just." Miss Marple stepped back, letting the doctor and Mrs. Winthrop handle the immediate crisis. But she knew one thing for sure. This was no accident. Grace's collapse wasn't just a fainting spell. Someone had deliberately poisoned her. Who would want to harm her? Reverend Pendleton's voice cut through the fog of confusion. Miss Marple's sharp eyes turned to him, and then she let them sweep the room. Every face here held a secret, and now that secret was threatening to come into the light. Miss Lambert, the gossiping widow, stood at the far side of the room clutching her shawl. Her eyes were wide with shock, but there was something in the way her lips trembled that made Miss Marple pause. "Someone's hiding something," Miss Marple thought to herself. But she did not voice the thought aloud. Her method was always the same. Wait, watch, and listen. People would reveal themselves, all in good time. The vicar had gone to stand near the window, peering out at the village square. His hands were clasped behind his back, but there was a tension in his posture, a hint of unease that Miss Marple had noted from the very first moment he had walked into the room. As the doctor worked, Mrs. Winthrop ushered the guests out of the drawing-room, her tone now far more brittle than it had been when they first arrived. "Please," she said, her voice steady but the strain evident. "Everyone should go home now. This is not something to be discussed here." But Miss Marple did not leave. She had no intention of departing just yet. After a few moments of careful thought, Miss Marple rose and excused herself from the room. She had noticed enough to begin forming her ideas, but now was the time to gather her thoughts in solitude. She moved quietly through the house, her footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Mrs. Winthrop had a small sitting room tucked at the back of the manor, a room filled with old photographs and porcelain dolls, an unassuming place for a woman who prized tradition so highly. The smell of tea still lingered in the air. The tea service had been set up in elegant trays, delicate china cups still placed on the silver serving cart. Nothing had seemed amiss when the guests first arrived, yet now everything felt somehow wrong, the normalcy of the scene a cruel mask for the unfolding drama. Miss Marple had a habit of studying everything. Familiar objects became windows into people's lives. A simple detail could often provide a crucial insight. Her eyes flicked to the table where the tray had been set. The cups, the sugar, the teaspoons, they were all in their places. But there was something not quite right about the arrangement of one particular cup. It was slightly askew, as though someone had moved it hastily and left it there. She reached for the cup, her fingers gently brushing the delicate porcelain. There was a faint residue around the rim. Too perfect. It was subtle, but Miss Marple's practiced hand knew exactly what it was. Poison. The same poison that had likely been slipped into Grace's glass. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by the soft creak of the door behind her. She turned, but no one was there. The house was silent once again, save for the distant murmur of voices from the other room. It was then that she heard it, the faintest sound of footsteps behind her. A shadow moved across the room, and Miss Marple knew she was not alone. Chapter 3. The evening sun had long since set, leaving the village of St. Mary's Well wrapped in an eerie stillness. The snow continued to fall, soft and quiet, as if nature itself was trying to keep the events of the day from being spoken aloud. Inside Mrs. Winthrop's manor, however, the silence was deafening. The guests, once a lively assembly, had all been sent home, and now the house was a hollow shell of its former self, echoing with unanswered questions. Miss Marple sat in the quiet sitting room, her eyes tracing the delicate patterns on the china cup she had removed from the tray. It had been untouched by the others, but the residue around the rim was too intentional, too deliberate to be ignored. It was a subtle clue, almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for it. But Miss Marple's mind had already pieced together its significance. The poison had been placed here, perhaps for someone else, perhaps for Grace, or perhaps for someone else entirely. Her hand trembled slightly as she set the cup down. It wasn't from age or fatigue, but from the weight of knowing that she was standing at the edge of something much darker than a mere accident. Grace's collapse had been no mere fainting spell. Miss Marple could feel the first tremors of a mystery unspooling, and she knew that it was only a matter of time before the truth would reveal itself, whether those involved liked it or not. Just as Miss Marple was about to gather her thoughts, there was a soft knock on the door. She had been expecting this moment. Dr. Hawkins, who had been caring for Grace, had stayed behind to gather his own observations. Miss Marple's attention shifted to the door, and she rose to open it. The doctor entered quietly, his brow furrowed in thought. "Miss Marple," he began, his voice measured. "Grace is stable for the moment, though I suspect the poison was not administered in large enough doses to be fatal. That is, if she receives the proper care immediately." He paused, his eyes darting around the room, as though the very walls were holding secrets. "But I can't explain how she could have ingested it. No one saw anything unusual. No one seems to know who might have done this." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, her keen eyes narrowing. Dr. Hawkins was a competent doctor, but he lacked the subtlety of observation that Miss Marple had honed over decades of watching people. He was eager for answers, but answers weren't always clear-cut. "Did you check the food and drink she had?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice soft yet commanding. Dr. Hawkins hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, everything seems in order. She didn't drink much at first, but she had a bit of tea, and the others who shared the same pot appear unharmed. But there is always a but," Miss Marple interrupted, almost to herself. "You're assuming the tea was the cause. But the tea was a social event, wasn't it? Multiple people drank from the same pot." "Yes, of course," Dr. Hawkins agreed, though he seemed a little unsure. "But Grace was the only one who collapsed. It doesn't make sense." Miss Marple's lips curved into a faint smile. "Exactly. The puzzle is in the details. You see, Doctor, the poison was meant for someone, but it was the timing that was off. It's not the drink alone that gives us the clue. It's the way Grace responded, and the way she didn't." She moved over to the table, her fingers brushing the surface of the tea tray once more. The delicate porcelain cups were all arranged neatly, as though nothing was out of place. But Miss Marple could feel it. There was something more, something missing. "I think we need to consider something else," she said, turning to face Dr. Hawkins. "I want you to think very carefully, Doctor. Was anyone else acting suspiciously before Grace collapsed? Was there a moment, a conversation, that seemed unusual?" Dr. Hawkins blinked, his face registering confusion. He thought back, clearly running through the details in his mind. I don't know, he said. Then his face darkened. Mrs. Winthrop was acting rather tense when Grace first sat down. But that's not unusual for her. She's always a bit on edge when it comes to these events. She wants everything to be perfect. Miss Marple nodded slowly. So, Mrs. Winthrop wasn't in any distress before Grace drank the tea? No, Dr. Hawkins said, shaking his head. She seemed fine. I see, Miss Marple said thoughtfully. Now let us consider something else entirely. The timing of the poisoning, the fact that Grace alone was affected. It's too calculated, Doctor. It's not random. Dr. Hawkins's brow furrowed. But how can that be? Why would anyone target her? That's exactly what we need to figure out, Miss Marple replied. People don't just poison others without a reason. There's a motive hiding somewhere, and it's tied to Grace herself. The question is why? The sound of footsteps interrupted their conversation as Mrs. Winthrop entered the room. Her face was pale, but she held herself upright with the precision of a woman who had been taught to maintain composure at all costs. I'm sorry to interrupt, Miss Marple, she said, her voice trembling only slightly. But I must ask, what has happened? Grace is still unconscious. Will she be all right? Miss Marple studied Mrs. Winthrop for a long moment, noticing how her eyes flicked nervously to the window, then back to the doctor. She's stable for now, Dr. Hawkins said, his voice reassuring. But we must be cautious. I'll return to her room shortly. Mrs. Winthrop's lips parted, as though she wanted to say something more. But she closed her mouth, a tightness creeping into her posture. There was something in her silence that spoke volumes. Miss Marple inclined her head. I understand this is a trying time, Mrs. Winthrop, but the situation is more complicated than we initially thought. Grace didn't just faint. She was poisoned. At this, Mrs. Winthrop's face went white. For a brief moment, the facade of control crumbled, and Miss Marple saw a flash of fear in her eyes. Chapter 4. The next morning brought with it a crisp coldness that settled over the village like a weight. The snow had stopped falling, but its presence lingered in the air, and the atmosphere in St. Mary's Well seemed to mirror the uncertainty that now clouded the once peaceful village. Miss Marple sat at her modest breakfast table, her gaze thoughtful as she stirred her tea. The morning light filtered through the lace curtains, casting a gentle glow on the room. But despite the quiet, a certain tension hung in the air, like the calm before a storm. It was clear to Miss Marple that the time had come for the first steps of the investigation. The guests at Mrs. Winthrop's party might have gone home, but their actions, or their silence, still held many answers. Miss Marple's mind was already making connections, drawing links between the subtle clues and the peculiarities she had observed the day before. After finishing her tea, Miss Marple made her way to the village square. The winter landscape was serene, the stark white snow covering everything in sight. It was hard to imagine that just the day before, the peaceful village had been shattered by the discovery of a poisoning. But that, Miss Marple knew, was the nature of life. Quiet on the surface, yet often teeming with secrets beneath. When she arrived at Mrs. Winthrop's house, the atmosphere inside was markedly different from the previous day. Grace was still unconscious, her mother at her side, her face drawn with worry. Miss Marple noted the absence of the usual servants. Perhaps they had been sent away for the day. Only Mrs. Winthrop and the doctor remained, quietly tending to Grace. "Miss Marple," Dr. Hawkins said as she entered, his voice carrying a note of concern. "I'm glad you've come. We need to talk. I've been examining Grace again, and while she's stable, the poison is still in her system. I can't say how much longer she'll remain unconscious, but there's no question it was intentional." Miss Marple nodded slowly, but her gaze shifted to the woman seated beside Grace. Mrs. Winthrop's face was pale, her eyes darting between Grace and the door, as though waiting for someone. Miss Marple had observed her last night, but today there was something more to her. A deep concealed anxiety that threatened to break through. "I believe I should have a word with your guests, Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but firm. "The answer is somewhere among them. I need to know more about who was here, who was close to Grace, and who might have had an opportunity to poison her." Mrs. Winthrop gave a quick, almost imperceptible nod, then spoke in a low voice. "You think someone among my guests did this? That's impossible. They're all good people." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow. "Sometimes good people have secrets, Mrs. Winthrop, and those secrets can lead to dangerous consequences. I don't wish to alarm you, but I must ask you to think carefully about the events of last evening. Did anyone behave out of the ordinary?" For a moment, Mrs. Winthrop hesitated. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if unsure whether to speak. Finally, she sighed and gestured toward the drawing room. "Perhaps you should talk to the others. I'm sure they can tell you more." Miss Marple nodded and turned to leave. She could sense Mrs. Winthrop's reluctance, but it wasn't enough to dissuade her. Something in the woman's manner was off, too controlled, too practiced. Miss Marple's instincts told her that she was hiding something, and it was time to dig deeper. The other guests, when spoken to, were a mixed bag of reactions. Mr. Andrews, the solicitor, was the first to arrive. He walked into the room with an air of quiet confidence, his coat draped neatly over his arm. He offered Miss Marple a tight smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Ah, Miss Marple, I hear you've been doing some investigating. What do you make of all this, then?" he asked, his voice smooth, almost too smooth. "I'm still gathering facts, Mr. Andrews," Miss Marple replied, her eyes locking onto his for a brief moment. "But I'd appreciate it if you could tell me what you saw last night. Did anything unusual happen during the party?" Mr. Andrews shifted uncomfortably. "Nothing out of the ordinary. Everyone was in high spirits, as you might expect. But you know how these events are. Lots of small talk, and the conversation dances around the usual topics. People don't pay attention to what's really going on." Miss Marple's gaze didn't falter. "And yet, there must have been something you noticed. You're a solicitor. You're used to noticing details that others miss." He hesitated, his eyes darting briefly toward the window, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of uncertainty. I suppose Mrs. Winthrop was a bit more nervous than usual. She's always a bit high-strung at these gatherings, but last night she seemed more preoccupied. I didn't think much of it at the time. She's been under a lot of stress lately. With her daughter's health and all that, it's hardly surprising." "Did you speak to Grace much?" Miss Marple pressed, her voice soft but insistent. "No, not much." She didn't seem like her usual self either. "A little distant. I thought maybe she had something on her mind, but I didn't push the matter. People have their private troubles after all." "Of course," Miss Marple murmured, her thoughts whirling. There was nothing overtly suspicious in his words, but there was something about the way he spoke that gave Miss Marple pause. The slight nervousness, the way he steered the conversation away from Grace, there was something more beneath the surface. The next to arrive was Miss Lambert, the widow, her face flushed from the cold air. She was visibly shaken, her hands trembling slightly as she greeted Miss Marple. "I'm so terribly sorry about all this," Miss Lambert said, her voice full of concern. "Grace is such a sweet girl. Who would do something so awful?" Miss Marple studied her closely. Miss Lambert was a woman who thrived on gossip, always quick to offer opinions on the private lives of others, but her reaction now seemed genuine, even if tinged with a little too much melodrama. "I'm sure it's a shock to everyone," Miss Marple replied calmly. "But we mustn't jump to conclusions just yet. I would like to hear your thoughts, Miss Lambert. What did you notice last night? Did anything unusual happen?" Miss Lambert's eyes darted to Mrs. Winthrop, and Miss Marple saw a flicker of suspicion there, quickly masked by a bright smile. "Well, I did notice that Mrs. Winthrop seemed awfully upset about something. She was in and out of the drawing room, speaking to Mr. Andrews, and there was a moment when she looked positively stricken." "And did you speak to Grace much?" Miss Marple asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Oh, no. Grace wasn't very social last night. She didn't even stay for the full tea. A bit odd, really, but you know how it is. People have their moods." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her thoughts spinning. It seemed everyone had something to say, but no one had quite the full picture. And as she well knew, the first suspects were always the ones who least expected it. Chapter 5. The morning after Miss Marple's conversations with the guests at Mrs. Winthrop's tea party left her mind swirling with possibilities. The more she spoke to the villagers, the more she realized how little they truly knew about one another, despite living in such a small, tight-knit community. Secrets were like the cobwebs in an old house, easily missed at first but impossible to ignore once they were exposed. Miss Marple made her way to Mrs. Winthrop's manor again, her pace unhurried but purposeful. The morning had come with its usual quiet, but now the lingering tension from the previous day's events felt thicker, like the fog that sometimes clung to the village before the sun rose. She had gathered some information, but she needed more, one more piece to help her unlock the mystery. The main house was still quiet when she arrived, the servants seemingly gone for the day. Mrs. Winthrop was in the sitting room with Grace, but there was no mistaking the aura of distress that filled the space. The once pristine manor now felt heavy, almost oppressive. Miss Marple took a seat by the window, allowing herself a moment to observe. The house had a cold, imposing quality to it today, its large windows shut tight against the winter chill. There was a certain finality in the air, as though something significant had already happened, and yet the full picture was still out of reach. Mrs. Winthrop entered, looking even more frazzled than the day before. Her eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but her lips were tightly pressed together, as if holding something back. She didn't acknowledge Miss Marple immediately, but instead walked over to a small writing desk by the window. "Good morning, Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said gently. "I hope Grace is feeling better." "Better, yes, but still not herself," Mrs. Winthrop replied, quickly, though her voice lacked its usual poise. She set a stack of papers on the desk and turned back to Miss Marple. "I'm afraid I've been distracted this morning, Miss Marple. The household has been out of sorts since last night." Miss Marple nodded, her sharp eyes tracking every movement Mrs. Winthrop made. I understand. I believe that's to be expected. It's a rather unsettling thing to wake up to. Mrs. Winthrop's gaze flickered to the papers on the desk before she turned to face Miss Marple. I'm sure you have many questions. It's just that the poisoning, well, I don't understand it. No one here would do such a thing, not to my daughter. I understand your distress, Miss Marple replied softly, her voice measured. But you must know by now that such things rarely happen without reason. Someone has their own motives, Mrs. Winthrop. We simply need to uncover them. She watched Mrs. Winthrop's reaction closely. The woman's fingers tightened around the edge of the desk, a subtle but telling gesture. Perhaps you could help me understand something. I've been thinking a great deal about last night's tea. Grace didn't drink much at first, as you mentioned, but I'm curious. Did she leave the room at any point? Mrs. Winthrop's posture stiffened slightly. She stayed seated throughout the evening, though she wasn't particularly chatty. I thought maybe she was just tired. It was a long evening. Miss Marple nodded, sensing Mrs. Winthrop's discomfort. And who served the tea? The servants, of course, Mrs. Winthrop answered, her voice snapping with a trace of impatience. Is there something you suspect about them? I'm not ruling anyone out, Mrs. Winthrop, Miss Marple said carefully. But I do wonder if there might have been something unusual about the tea itself. The cup that Grace drank from, was it her usual cup, or was it different? Mrs. Winthrop seemed to hesitate. It was just a cup from the usual set, I believe. Why? Do you think the cup was tampered with? I can't be sure just yet, Miss Marple said, her tone quiet but insistent. But it's worth considering that Grace's cup may have been specially chosen, perhaps even the last one filled, or one placed too near the others. It's the small things we must examine. Before she could continue, a noise interrupted them. A soft rustling from the far corner of the room caught Miss Marple's attention. She turned her head to see Grace standing in the doorway, her face pale, but her posture straight. She looked far better than she had the previous night, but Miss Marple could see the shadows under her eyes. Grace's lips were pressed tightly together, as though she were holding back words she didn't want to speak. Grace, you should be resting, Mrs. Winthrop said sharply, her voice tinged with a sudden, protective urgency. I'm fine, Mother, Grace replied, quickly, her voice steady but strained. I've been lying down long enough. I need to know what's happening. Miss Marple stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Grace. I can understand your impatience, Miss Winthrop, but the answers will come in time. There's no need to rush this. Grace met her gaze with a level stare, but Miss Marple could see the faintest trace of uncertainty in her eyes. I don't think I'll be able to relax until I know what's going on. There must be someone who has an idea of who did this. Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes twinkling with that subtle spark of knowledge that Grace had not yet learned to recognize. I suspect the answers are hidden in plain sight. All we have to do is pay close attention to what others have overlooked. Grace nodded, though her brow remained furrowed. As she turned to leave the room, her eyes caught something on the table, an old photograph in a frame, half covered by the papers Winthrop had left there. Miss Marple watched her pause for a brief moment, her fingers brushing lightly over the glass. Something about the photograph caught Grace's attention. She lingered for a moment longer than necessary before she quickly moved away, as though catching herself. Miss Marple's eyes followed Grace's movements, noting the photograph with growing interest. She moved toward the table as Grace left the room and took a closer look at the image. It was a photograph of a much younger Grace, her arm around a man, someone Miss Marple hadn't seen before. A man with dark, piercing eyes and a sharp, angular face. It was the first time Miss Marple had seen this photograph, and though it seemed innocuous, she couldn't help but feel that it held more significance than it appeared. The man in the picture, he was far too important to be ignored. But for now, Miss Marple kept her thoughts to herself. Chapter 6. The morning after Miss Marple's visit to Mrs. Winthrop's manor, the fog that had hung thick over the village seemed to lift slightly, but the sense of unease still lingered. The chill in the air, combined with the weight of the mystery that had not yet revealed itself, kept the entire village on edge. Even the snow, which had blanketed the streets, seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple knew that it was time to press further. She had collected enough fragments of information, enough subtle hints, to start pushing at the walls of silence that surrounded the guests from last night's tea. Each of them, whether consciously or unconsciously, was hiding something. It was time for them to face the truth. Today Miss Marple had a particular plan in mind. She needed to confront the ones who had most to lose from Grace's poisoning, and perhaps in doing so, she would uncover the secret that was quietly unraveling beneath the surface of their interactions. The first person she visited was Mr. Andrews, the solicitor. Though Miss Marple had already questioned him once, something about his behaviour the previous day had unsettled her. He had been too quick to dismiss the events, too eager to explain away his nervousness with nonchalance. She had noted his discomfort around Grace's poisoning, and now she intended to push him a little further. Miss Marple arrived at his office in the village centre, a modest stone building with a small sign that read, Andrews and Sons, Solicitors. The door creaked open as she entered, and Mr. Andrews looked up from behind his desk. His expression was carefully neutral, but Miss Marple could detect the flicker of recognition in his eyes. Miss Marple, to what do I owe the pleasure? He asked, standing and offering her a chair. His voice remained smooth, but the slightest tightening at the corner of his mouth told her that he wasn't entirely at ease. I'm afraid I've come to ask a few more questions, Mr. Andrews, Miss Marple said, her tone gentle but firm. There are still some things about last night that don't sit right with me. Mr. Andrews hesitated, his eyes darting toward the window. I told you everything I know, Miss Marple. There's no reason to keep probing. Miss Marple didn't let him off the hook. Is there really nothing else you could tell me? About the people present, perhaps? Anything that might have seemed out of place? He shifted in his chair. I've already told you that Mrs. Winthrop seemed upset, though I don't think that's unusual for her. She's always worried about something. As for Grace, she seemed a little distracted, but I don't think she meant any harm. And yet, she's the one who's poisoned, Miss Marple interrupted, her gaze steady. There must be more to it than that, Mr. Andrews. Why would someone poison her of all people? He looked uncomfortable, his fingers tapping the edge of the desk. I really don't know. It could have been a mistake, couldn't it? A misunderstanding. Grace is a bit of an enigma at times. Perhaps she had some enemies we don't know about. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured, but I think there's more at play here. You see, I've been thinking about a photograph I saw at Mrs. Winthrop's house. A photograph of Grace, but with a man I've never seen before. Do you know anything about him? Mr. Andrews's expression faltered for just a moment, but it was enough. He quickly regained his composure, his voice becoming colder. "I don't know who that man is, Miss Marple. I've never seen him." Miss Marple continued to study him, her eyes narrowing. "You seem rather certain of that. But I think you know more than you're letting on, Mr. Andrews. I think you know exactly who that man is and why he matters." He stiffened, his jaw clenched. "I'm afraid you're mistaken, Miss Marple. I've told you all I know. If you have any further questions, I suggest you take them to someone else." Miss Marple rose from her chair, her eyes never leaving him. "You'll tell me in time, Mr. Andrews. They always do." She turned and left the office, the door clicking shut behind her. The interview had been a fruitless one, but Miss Marple was no closer to the answers she sought. Still, she had learned something valuable. Mr. Andrews was hiding something, and that something might just be the key to unravelling the mystery. Next, Miss Marple paid a visit to Miss Lambert, the widow who had seemed so eager to offer her opinions on everyone else. She had no doubt that Miss Lambert's gossip-laden tongue would eventually spill something of value, whether she realized it or not. When Miss Lambert saw Miss Marple approaching her modest cottage, she opened the door wide, her face full of forced cheerfulness. "Miss Marple, what a surprise! What can I do for you?" "I'm afraid I have more questions, Miss Lambert," Miss Marple replied, her voice warm but firm. "It seems there's more to this poisoning than meets the eye. Perhaps you can help me piece things together." Miss Lambert's eyes widened slightly, her hand tightening on the doorframe. "I've already told you everything I know. What else is there to say? Your knowledge, I'm sure, is invaluable, Miss Lambert." "You're always so quick to notice things," Miss Marple said, her tone honeyed, yet with an underlying sharpness. "Perhaps you noticed something last night, something that others didn't." Miss Lambert shifted uncomfortably, her fingers twitching. "Well, now that you mention it, I did overhear something. Mrs. Winthrop and Mr. Andrews were talking in hushed tones for quite a while. It didn't seem like a conversation about something trivial, if you know what I mean. They both looked worried." "Worried," Miss Marple repeated. "About what exactly?" "I'm not sure," Miss Lambert replied, glancing around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "But they seemed to be talking about Grace, and not in the nicest way, I might add." "Interesting," Miss Marple said, her mind racing. "Did you hear anything else? Perhaps something that might explain why they were so concerned about Grace?" Miss Lambert hesitated. "I didn't hear much more, but I think it had something to do with money. Mrs. Winthrop, well, she's had some financial trouble lately. There were whispers about it at the last charity event." Miss Marple's thoughts swirled. Financial trouble? That would explain a great deal. But why would it lead to poisoning? Was Grace somehow tied to these troubles? Or was she simply in the wrong place at the wrong time? Before Miss Lambert could offer more, Miss Marple stood up and smiled politely. "Thank you, Miss Lambert. I'm sure this information will be very useful." As Miss Marple left the widow's cottage, she felt a sense of quiet satisfaction. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but the full picture remained frustratingly out of reach. I knew now that the key to this case lay in the secrets the villagers were so eager to keep buried. Chapter 7. The afternoon had settled into a heavy quiet. The once familiar sounds of the village, carriages rolling down cobbled streets, the murmur of daily life, now felt muted, as though even the air was waiting for something to break. Miss Marple stood by her window, her eyes trained on the snow-laden landscape outside. The world outside the window seemed perfectly still, but inside her mind, the mystery was unfolding with rapid speed. She had gathered many pieces, yet there was something crucial still missing, some hidden truth that would pull the threads together. The interviews with Mr. Andrews and Miss Lambert had provided a few breadcrumbs, but they were still nothing more than fragments. There was a deeper connection between Mrs. Winthrop, her daughter Grace, and the shadowy figures who had begun to surface in Miss Marple's investigation. And now she was beginning to suspect that Grace's poisoning had less to do with mere malice and more to do with desperation. A dangerous kind of desperation that could drive people to do unspeakable things. She left the comfort of her small sitting room and walked across the village square, her thoughts clouded with possibilities. Mrs. Winthrop had been a constant presence in the background of the case, but her reluctance to share details spoke volumes. Her discomfort was palpable, something Miss Marple had learned to interpret as guilt. But guilt for what? And who was she shielding with her silence? Arriving at Mrs. Winthrop's manor once again, Miss Marple felt the familiar sense of unease that always accompanied a house with too many hidden corners. She was met by the butler, who was as taciturn as ever, and led through the quiet halls to Mrs. Winthrop's sitting room. "I've been expecting you, Miss Marple," Mrs. Winthrop said the moment Miss Marple entered, her voice flat but polite. "I trust you've made progress in your investigation." "Some progress, yes," Miss Marple replied, taking her seat. "But I still don't feel we have the full picture. There are still questions I need answered. And I have a suspicion that you know more than you've shared with me." Mrs. Winthrop stiffened, but her expression remained carefully controlled. "I've told you all I know. What more do you need from me?" Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. "It's not so much what you've said, Mrs. Winthrop. It's what you've left unsaid. There's more to this poisoning than I think you're willing to admit." Mrs. Winthrop opened her mouth as if to protest, but the words died on her lips. Miss Marple could see her struggling to keep her composure. It was an old, familiar game, the one where the truth was teased out in fragments, slowly, methodically. Miss Marple had played it countless times, and she had no intention of stopping now. "You see," Miss Marple continued, "I've noticed certain things about Grace, certain inconsistencies in the way people speak about her. And I can't help but wonder if she's caught in the middle of something much bigger than a simple poisoning. I suspect there's a deeper motive here. Something tied to financial troubles, perhaps. Something to do with her future." Mrs. Winthrop's face paled as Miss Marple spoke. She rose abruptly from her chair, walking to the window with her back turned to Miss Marple. For a moment, she said nothing. The silence stretched out, thick and uncomfortable. Miss Marple didn't press her. She knew the woman needed time. Finally, Mrs. Winthrop spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right. Grace's future has been too uncertain. She was supposed to marry, but instead she's become a burden I can't carry any longer." The words hung in the air, and Miss Marple felt the subtle shift in the atmosphere. Mrs. Winthrop's confession, though vague, opened a door to a darker truth. "Tell me more, Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said gently. "Who was Grace supposed to marry? Was this the man in the photograph?" Mrs. Winthrop's shoulders tensed at the mention of the photograph, but she didn't turn around. Yes, his name was Richard Fairmont. He was a wealthy man, a man who could have secured Grace's future. But he disappeared some months ago, left without a word. I'm sure it was because of Grace's health. I told her not to say anything to anyone, but you know how these things get. Richard Fairmont disappeared? Miss Marple repeated, her voice soft but insistent. Just like that. Yes, just like that, Mrs. Winthrop said, her voice bitter now. He left her without explanation, and it ruined her. The humiliation, the gossip, she became so reclusive after that. I thought it would pass, but it only worsened. The shame was unbearable. And now, here we are, in the midst of all this. Miss Marple sat in silence for a moment, piecing together the fragments. She had known, of course, that the Winthrop family was hiding something. Nothing ever came without its price, especially in a place like this. But the disappearance of Grace's fiancé added a new layer of complexity to the case. Was his disappearance connected to Grace's poisoning? Was there more to Richard Fairmont than he seemed? And if Mrs. Winthrop had been hiding this from everyone, what other secrets had she kept buried beneath the surface? Before Miss Marple could ask any more questions, the door to the sitting room opened, and Dr. Hawkins stepped inside. His face was grim, and his usual calm demeanour was replaced with an expression of urgency. "Miss Marple, I think you need to hear this," he said, his voice tight with concern. "There's been another development." Mrs. Winthrop turned sharply to face him, her face betraying a flicker of panic before she masked it once more. "What is it, Doctor?" Miss Marple asked, her voice calm, though her mind was already racing. "It's Grace," Dr. Hawkins said. "She's been taken. Someone has taken her from her room." The words hit Miss Marple like a thunderclap. Grace had disappeared, vanished right under their noses. Miss Marple's gaze shifted to Mrs. Winthrop, whose face had drained of colour. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fall into place, but now the mystery had taken a dangerous turn. Chapter 8. The news of Grace's disappearance rippled through the air, unsettling the already fragile atmosphere in Mrs. Winthrop's manor. Miss Marple stood motionless, processing the sudden development. Grace, the very person at the heart of the mystery, had vanished. It was the last thing Miss Marple had expected, and yet, in hindsight, it felt inevitable. Something far more sinister was at play now. Dr. Hawkins, who had delivered the news, stood near the door, his hand gripping the frame as if trying to steady himself. Mrs. Winthrop, who had seemed fragile before, now appeared completely shattered. Her face was pale, and her eyes darted about the room in frantic confusion, as though she could will her daughter to reappear simply by thinking about her. "We must find her," Mrs. Winthrop said, her voice wavering with a mixture of fear and disbelief. "She can't have gone far. This is all too much." Miss Marple nodded quietly, her thoughts already racing. Grace's disappearance was a crucial twist. But who would take her, and why? Was it connected to the poisoning? Or was it something even darker? Something Grace herself had been involved in? "Doctor," Miss Marple said, turning her attention to Dr. Hawkins. "Have you checked the rest of the house? Any sign of forced entry? Anything unusual?" Dr. Hawkins shook his head. "No, nothing like that. The servants say they've seen nothing. It's as if Grace simply vanished into thin air." Miss Marple looked thoughtfully at Mrs. Winthrop. "Tell me, Mrs. Winthrop, when did you last see your daughter?" I just spoke to her a few hours ago," Mrs. Winthrop replied, her voice trembling. She was lying down in her room, resting. She seemed quiet, but not unusual. I thought she needed some time alone after everything, after the shock of last night. I left her in her room. Miss Marple's mind worked quickly. Something didn't add up. If Grace had vanished so suddenly, how had she managed to disappear without leaving any trace? Was it a voluntary escape, or had someone taken her? Were there any visitors? Miss Marple asked. Anyone who might have had access to her room? Mrs. Winthrop looked flustered. No one. No one except the doctor, of course. Grace has been ill, and Dr. Hawkins has been attending to her. Is there anyone else who could have entered the house? Miss Marple pressed, her gaze piercing. Mrs. Winthrop hesitated. I don't think so. We don't have any staff at the moment, just the housekeeper. But she's been busy with the laundry. She couldn't have gone upstairs. Miss Marple made a mental note of this but didn't comment further. The lack of witnesses only made the mystery more perplexing. Someone had taken Grace, but who and why? I'll need to inspect the house myself, Miss Marple said. I need to understand where Grace might have gone, or if someone helped her disappear. Mrs. Winthrop nodded, her hands wringing together. Of course, Miss Marple, please, find her. Miss Marple's mind was already turning over the possibilities. Grace's sudden disappearance, could it be voluntary? Or had she been coerced? If Grace had left on her own accord, was it to protect someone? Or was she being hidden away for a different reason altogether? She set out through the house, her eyes scanning every room with a quiet, practiced attention to detail. The grand drawing room was as immaculate as ever, its dark wood panelling and floral upholstery appearing untouched by the events of the past 24 hours. The hallway, though elegant, felt cold now, empty. In the corner of the hallway, Miss Marple stopped. It was a small detail, easily overlooked by anyone else, but she could see it clearly. The door to Grace's room was slightly ajar. She had not been informed that anyone had entered or left Grace's room since the doctor had come to check on her. This was curious. Carefully, she pushed the door open further. Inside, the room was as still as the rest of the house, but something caught her eye. On the floor near the window was a small silver chain, tangled in a heap, a necklace perhaps. Miss Marple leaned down to pick it up. It was delicate, almost fragile in its design, and though it was simple, there was a certain elegance to it. Miss Marple's thoughts sharpened. Grace would not leave a piece of jewellery behind unless she had been in a hurry. Had she been in a rush to leave, or had someone else taken her? Her mind flashed back to the photograph she had seen earlier, the picture of Grace and a man. Was this necklace connected to him? Miss Marple's fingers tightened around the silver chain. There was something more to this. She could feel it. Just then a faint sound echoed through the house. Footsteps, light and hurried, coming from the staircase. Miss Marple's heart quickened, but she remained still. The steps grew closer, and then the door to Grace's room creaked open. Mrs. Winthrop stood in the doorway, her eyes wide and frantic. "Have you found her?" she asked breathlessly. Miss Marple didn't answer immediately. Instead, she held up the necklace, letting it catch the light. Mrs. Winthrop's eyes went immediately to it, her face paling. "That was hers," she said quickly. "Grace's necklace. But how did it get here?" Miss Marple stepped forward, placing the necklace in Mrs. Winthrop's trembling hands. "This is what I intend to find out, Mrs. Winthrop. You know more. about your daughter's disappearance than you're letting on." Mrs. Winthrop looked down at the necklace, her face stricken. "I don't know what you mean. I'm just as confused as you are, Miss Marple." Miss Marple didn't press further. Not yet, but the necklace had spoken volumes. The timing of Grace's disappearance, the hurried abandonment of such a personal item, it all pointed to one thing. Grace hadn't gone willingly. Someone had taken her. And Miss Marple was closer than ever to uncovering who and why. Chapter 9. Miss Marple's thoughts were a whirlwind as she made her way down the hallway, Mrs. Winthrop trailing behind her, her footsteps hesitant. The necklace, still clutched in the woman's trembling hands, had provided a clue, but not enough of one to explain the full picture. The frantic confusion Mrs. Winthrop displayed, though genuine, only deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. Was she simply a worried mother, or was there something more at play? "Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said, turning to face her as they reached the foot of the stairs. "I need to ask you a question, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Mrs. Winthrop looked as though she might protest, but then she nodded. "I don't know what more I can tell you. I've already said everything I know." Miss Marple regarded her carefully. "You've been hiding something, haven't you? About Grace? About her fiancé, Richard Fairmont?" At the mention of his name, Mrs. Winthrop stiffened visibly. Her grip tightened on the necklace, and her eyes darted nervously toward the door, as if expecting someone to walk in and overhear them. She had the look of a woman whose carefully built walls were beginning to crack. "Richard Fairmont disappeared months ago," she said finally, her voice quiet. "He wasn't the man I thought he was. Grace was devastated by his disappearance, but she never told me the truth. She wouldn't. I think it was because she was ashamed." "Shamed?" Miss Marple asked, though she already suspected what Mrs. Winthrop wasn't saying. "Ashamed of what, exactly?" Mrs. Winthrop hesitated, her breath catching in her throat. He was in debt. There was trouble, financial trouble. And when he disappeared, it left Grace exposed. She had no one to turn to." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, keeping her voice soft. "And did you know about this debt before he left?" Mrs. Winthrop's eyes flickered toward the staircase, a flash of discomfort crossing her face. "No, I didn't, but I found out later, after he disappeared, and I was terrified. I thought Grace would be ruined if anyone found out. So I kept it a secret. No one needed to know. No one would understand." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "But someone did know, didn't they? Someone who is now using that knowledge to their advantage." Mrs. Winthrop's face paled. "What do you mean?" "The necklace," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but deliberate. "I think Grace left in a hurry, perhaps because she was afraid of something, or someone. But she didn't take this necklace with her on her own accord. Someone took it, and someone is holding her somewhere. I don't believe she left willingly." The silence that followed was thick. Mrs. Winthrop's face was a picture of silent anguish, her eyes brimming with unspoken fears. Her hand tightened around the necklace until her knuckles turned white. Miss Marple watched her for a moment before continuing. "Tell me, Mrs. Winthrop, where did Grace keep this necklace? Was it something she wore often, or was it kept in her room?" I don't know," Mrs. Winthrop whispered, her voice strained. "I think she kept it locked away. It was the only thing left from Richard. A gift he had given her. She was very attached to it." "Which means someone who knew her well could easily have taken it, knowing its value to her," Miss Marple concluded, her mind whirling. That narrows things down." Mrs. Winthrop shook her head, the weight of the conversation clearly starting to overwhelm her. "I don't know who would do this, Miss Marple. Please, please find her. I don't want anyone to suffer because of me. This is all my fault." "It's not your fault, Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said quietly, "but you may be the key to uncovering the truth. I suspect that someone is using the financial trouble Richard left behind as leverage. But who? And what do they want with Grace now?" Before Mrs. Winthrop could respond, a knock came at the door. Miss Marple looked up sharply, her instincts instantly alert. She stepped toward the door, turning the handle before Mrs. Winthrop could protest. Standing in the doorway was a man Miss Marple had not yet seen, tall, with a gaunt face and dark, searching eyes. He wore the unmistakable uniform of a local constable, but his manner was far from official. "Miss Marple?" he asked, his voice hesitant but firm. "I believe you might want to hear this." Without waiting for an invitation, he stepped inside, a small bundle of papers in his hands. "It's about Richard Fairmont. We found something." The mention of Richard Fairmont's name caught Mrs. Winthrop by surprise. She turned, her face pale. "What do you mean? What have you found?" The constable set the papers down on the table, his fingers brushing over the stack before he spoke again. "We've been investigating Richard Fairmont's disappearance. Turns out he wasn't the upstanding man everyone thought he was. He was involved in some rather unsavory business dealings. And it seems that Grace wasn't the only one affected by his disappearance." Miss Marple watched the constable carefully, her mind clicking into place. "And you believe this might be connected to Grace's poisoning?" The constable nodded grimly. "We found records of some loans Richard took out, some debts, that were never repaid. It seems that someone had a very good reason for wanting him gone, and now we believe that person might be targeting Grace. She's connected to him, and they know it." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to take shape. Richard Fairmont's debts, his disappearance, and now Grace's sudden poisoning. It all made sense, but there was still a crucial element missing. Who had been pulling the strings? Turning to Mrs. Winthrop, Miss Marple said, "Do you remember anyone else who might have known about Richard's debts? Anyone else who might have been involved in his disappearance?" Mrs. Winthrop's face contorted with a mixture of regret and fear. "There was one person, one man who might know more. His name is Mr. Palmer. He was an associate of Richard's. I'm not sure exactly what their business was, but it wasn't good. He came around a few times before Richard left. I never trusted him." Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with the spark of recognition. Palmer. He was the missing piece, and she would find him, no matter how deeply he tried to bury his secrets. Chapter 10. The tension in the air seemed to thicken with every passing hour. Miss Marple stood by the window of Mrs. Winthrop's drawing room, her eyes scanning the snow-covered grounds outside, though her mind was firmly fixed on the web of deceit that had been spinning ever tighter around the Winthrop family. Every clue she had gathered pointed to one name, Mr. Palmer. He was the missing link, the one person who might hold the final pieces of the puzzle, and Miss Marple was certain he had far more to do with this than he appeared. She turned back to Mrs. Winthrop, who had sunk into an armchair by the fire, her face pale with worry. Despite her insistence that Grace was the only thing that mattered, Miss Marple could tell the woman's mind was elsewhere, lingering on old fears, old secrets. I need to find Mr. Palmer, Miss Marple said, her voice calm but resolute. And I need you to tell me everything you know about him. He's connected to Richard Fairmont's disappearance. I believe he's been pulling the strings all along. Mrs. Winthrop's face tightened at the mention of Palmer's name, her eyes darting toward the door, as though she half expected him to walk in at any moment. I never trusted him, she murmured, but he was always polite, charming even, always talking about business deals, investments. He was more involved with Richard than I ever fully understood. Did you ever meet him? Miss Marple pressed. Do you know where he might be now? Mrs. Winthrop hesitated, her eyes clouding over with the weight of memory. Once or twice, when Grace was young, he visited the house, but it's been years. I haven't seen him since Richard's disappearance. Do you have any idea where he might be now? Miss Marple asked again, her gaze unyielding. I think he moved to London, Mrs. Winthrop replied slowly, but I'm not sure. I don't know where he lives or who he associates with these days. You should be careful, Miss Marple. People like him aren't to be trusted, not after what happened. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. The puzzle pieces were coming together, but the full picture was still a mystery. Richard Fairmont had been deeply in debt, and now it seemed Palmer was involved in those dealings. It was clear that Grace had somehow become a pawn in a dangerous game, a game that someone had decided to finish by force. Do you have anything of Richard's? Miss Marple asked, her eyes narrowing slightly. Anything that could tell me more about his relationship with Palmer? Perhaps something he left behind? Mrs. Winthrop seemed to hesitate for a moment, but then she sighed and nodded. There's one thing, she said, a letter. It was addressed to Richard, but it was never sent. I found it among his things after he disappeared. I didn't know what to make of it at the time. It's in the study. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. This was it, the final clue. May I see it? She asked. Mrs. Winthrop nodded and stood, leading Miss Marple to the study. The room was dimly lit, its heavy curtains drawn, leaving it feeling almost oppressive. The study was filled with leather-bound books, antique furniture, and various trinkets that seemed to hold no meaning, save for the atmosphere of quiet neglect that lingered in the air. But Miss Marple didn't allow herself to be distracted by the surroundings. She was focused on the desk, where a stack of papers sat. Mrs. Winthrop reached into a drawer and pulled out a single envelope. It was yellowed with age, the ink on the front faded but still legible. I never opened it, she said quietly. I thought it was private, but now... Miss Marple took the letter gently, her fingers brushing over the paper as she unfolded it. Her eyes skimmed the words quickly, her mind already piecing them together. The letter was addressed to Richard Fairmont, and its contents were a revelation. It spoke of a business venture gone wrong, one that had put Richard deep into debt, and the name that stood out above all others was Palmer's. The letter mentioned a final warning, a demand for repayment, and a threat that someone would pay the price if the debt wasn't settled. Miss Marple's eyes flicked back to Mrs. Winthrop. This letter confirms everything, she said. Palmer was not just a business associate. He was a creditor. And Richard Fairmont's disappearance was likely the result of a financial dispute. But that still doesn't explain Grace's poisoning. Mrs. Winthrop looked as though the weight of the revelation had finally begun to sink in. I didn't know. I had no idea Richard was in so deep. "I think Grace must have found out," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "Perhaps she was going to expose it. But when Richard disappeared, it left her vulnerable. And someone took advantage of that vulnerability." "Palmer?" Mrs. Winthrop asked, her voice filled with dread. Miss Marple nodded. "I believe so. And now he's taken Grace. He knows that she's the key to everything." There was a long pause as the gravity of the situation hung heavily between them. Miss Marple turned back to the letter, studying the final lines. There was something in the tone, something almost familiar. She read the words again carefully, and then it struck her. The handwriting. It was neat, professional, but there was a certain coldness in it, a detachment. Miss Marple glanced up sharply. "Mrs. Winthrop," she said, her voice suddenly firm, "this letter wasn't written by Palmer. It was written by someone else. Someone who's been controlling him all along." Mrs. Winthrop stared at her in confusion. "What do you mean? Who could be controlling Palmer?" "I'm not sure yet," Miss Marple said, her mind racing. "But I know this. There's more to this story than just business dealings. The financial debt is only part of it. Whoever has been pulling the strings, whoever is behind this, they want something more than money. They want power, control." The pieces were falling into place, but Miss Marple's mind refused to settle on one conclusion. The truth was just out of reach, like a shadow in the dark. But she could feel it, lurking at the edge of everything. "I'll find Grace, Mrs. Winthrop," Miss Marple said, her voice unwavering, "and when I do, I'll expose the truth." As she left the study and stepped back into the hallway, the weight of the mystery felt heavier than ever. Whoever was behind this was playing a dangerous game, and Miss Marple knew she had to act quickly before the stakes grew even higher. Chapter 11. The tension in St. Mary's Well had reached its peak. The snow outside had begun to thaw, leaving behind the remnants of a bitter winter. But inside Mrs. Winthrop's manor, the coldness remained, unnervingly present. Miss Marple, despite her calm exterior, could feel the weight of the mystery closing in around her. Grace Winthrop was still missing, and the more she uncovered, the more Miss Marple realized that the answers she sought were being deliberately hidden by someone who feared the truth would destroy them. The letter had been a significant breakthrough. It had opened up new avenues of suspicion, especially concerning Palmer, the elusive man who seemed to have ties not only to Richard Fairmont's disappearance, but to the financial troubles that had plagued the Winthrop family. Miss Marple's suspicion that someone was controlling Palmer had not wavered. But now, the search for Grace had taken on a new urgency. The clock was ticking, and whoever had taken her had already shown that they were willing to go to extreme lengths. Miss Marple sat in her usual spot by the window, staring out at the now slushy street below. The village, which had once seemed so peaceful, now felt like a stage set for a drama that was far darker than anything Miss Marple had anticipated. She had played her part as a quiet observer for so long, but now the time had come for action. The mystery was no longer just about uncovering the facts. It was about finding Grace before it was too late. The soft sound of footsteps brought her out of her reverie. Mrs. Winthrop entered the room, her eyes hollow with worry, but her posture still straight, as if she were trying to maintain control over a situation that was slipping away from her grasp. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Winthrop said quietly, "have you learned anything new? Have you found Grace?" Miss Marple rose slowly, her gaze steady. I'm afraid I haven't yet found Grace, Mrs. Winthrop. But I've learned something very important." She paused, watching the older woman carefully. "I believe I now know who is behind her disappearance. And why?" Mrs. Winthrop's face blanched. "Who?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Tell me, please. I must know." "I believe the key to this is Palmer," Miss Marple said calmly. "But he is not working alone. There's someone else, someone who has been pulling his strings from the beginning." Mrs. Winthrop took a step back, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You think Palmer is behind all of this? But he's just a man in debt. What could he possibly have to do with Grace's disappearance?" Miss Marple's lips tightened. "Palmer is part of the puzzle, Mrs. Winthrop. But I suspect the person who is really behind this, who has been manipulating Palmer, is someone much closer to home, someone who's been hiding in plain sight." At this, Mrs. Winthrop took another step back, her face pale as if the room was suddenly closing in on her. "What are you saying, Miss Marple?" she whispered. "Are you accusing me?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "I'm not accusing you, Mrs. Winthrop, but you are connected to this mystery more than you realize, and I think you know exactly who I mean." A tremor passed through Mrs. Winthrop's body, her hands twisting the hem of her dress in agitation. No, it can't be. It just can't be. He's gone. He's been gone for years." Miss Marple's voice softened. "Richard Fairmont didn't disappear on his own, did he? And I don't believe he was killed over a mere debt. Someone wanted him out of the picture for good. Someone who had everything to gain." Mrs. Winthrop's eyes filled with tears, and she staggered backward into a chair, crumbling into it as though the weight of the revelation had finally broken through her defences. "I never wanted this for Grace," she whispered, her voice choking. "I never wanted her to be caught in the middle of all this. But I was afraid of what would happen if the truth came out. Richard, he was involved with people who would do anything to get their money. I thought he'd come back. I thought he'd return to fix it all. But Richard didn't return, did he?" Miss Marple uttered quietly. "Because he couldn't. Someone made sure of that." Mrs. Winthrop closed her eyes, her face streaked with tears. "I tried to protect Grace. I tried to keep her from knowing the truth. But the truth was always there, lurking. And now it's too late." Miss Marple felt a pang of sympathy for the older woman, but her voice remained firm. "It's not too late, but we need to act quickly. Whoever took Grace, whoever is behind this, is making their final move. We need to expose the truth before they do more damage." There was a long, painful silence before Mrs. Winthrop finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're right, Miss Marple. I should have told you sooner. But I was afraid. I thought I could protect her. I thought I could keep the past buried. But now I see that the past is always waiting to resurface, and when it does, it brings everything with it." Miss Marple nodded, her eyes sharp with purpose. "It's time to confront the past, Mrs. Winthrop. Grace needs to be found, and Palmer is the key to that. He knows where she is, and he knows what happened to Richard. The question now is, what is he hiding?" As Miss Marple spoke, she could see the shadow of realization dawn in Mrs. Winthrop's eyes. She was no longer a woman trying to protect her daughter from the truth. She was someone who had finally acknowledged the cost of keeping those secrets for so long. "We need to find Palmer," Miss Marple said, "and we need to find him now. The longer we wait, the greater the risk to Grace." Mrs. Winthrop wiped her eyes. her hands trembling but her resolve strengthening her. "Where do we begin?" Miss Marple's gaze hardened. "We go to London. We find Palmer, and we make him tell us everything." With that, the plan was set into motion. There was no turning back now. Grace's life depended on the next steps, and Miss Marple knew that every second counted. She had always been patient, but now, as the mystery reached its climax, there was no time to waste. The pieces of the puzzle were all but in place. It was time to confront the person who had been pulling the strings, and to make sure the truth would finally be revealed. Chapter 12. London was a city of shadows. The fog rolled in from the Thames, cloaking the streets in a veil of mystery. The bustling noises of the city, the clattering of carriages, the murmur of voices. It all seemed distant and muffled as Miss Marple stood in the heart of it, her gaze sharp, her mind focused. The game had reached its final move. Mrs. Winthrop had agreed, albeit reluctantly, to accompany Miss Marple to London. The journey was long, filled with uncomfortable silences, but it was necessary. The time for secrets was over. They were about to confront the man who had woven the tangled web that had ensnared Grace, Richard Fairmont, and the Winthrop family. It had taken several hours, but Miss Marple had finally traced Palmer's location to an unassuming townhouse on the outskirts of the city. From the outside, it looked like any other residence, modest, almost inconspicuous. But Miss Marple knew better. This was where the final answers lay. As they approached the front door, Mrs. Winthrop's hand trembled slightly. Her anxiety was palpable, but Miss Marple had no time for hesitation. The truth had been hidden for far too long, and it was time to expose it for everyone to see. "Stay close," Miss Marple said softly, her voice a reassuring whisper. "I'll handle the questions." Mrs. Winthrop nodded, though her face was drawn, pale from fear and exhaustion. She had never expected her life to come to this. But Miss Marple had come to understand that sometimes a person's darkest secrets must be faced head-on. Miss Marple knocked firmly on the door, and the sound echoed through the quiet street. A moment passed before the door creaked open. Standing in the doorway was Palmer himself, a tall man with sharp features and cold, calculating eyes. His face stiffened slightly upon seeing Miss Marple, but he didn't flinch. He had no reason to be afraid, at least not yet. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice smooth, almost too calm. "What brings you to my door?" Miss Marple met his gaze steadily. "We need to talk, Mr. Palmer, about Grace Winthrop and about Richard Fairmont." Palmer's expression remained unreadable, but Miss Marple saw the slight tightening in his jaw. The man was hiding something. She could feel it in the air, like a palpable weight pressing down on them both. "Grace is not here," Palmer said coldly, his eyes darting toward Mrs. Winthrop, who stood a few steps behind Miss Marple, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "She has nothing to do with this." "Do you think I'm foolish, Mr. Palmer?" Miss Marple's voice was quiet, but it carried an undeniable authority. "We both know that Grace is at the center of all this, and we know you're involved. It's time to tell us the truth." For a brief moment, Palmer hesitated. Then, with a resigned sigh, he stepped aside, allowing them to enter. Inside, the house was sparsely furnished. The decor was cold, clinical, as if designed to make anyone who entered feel unwelcome. Miss Marple's sharp eyes scanned the room quickly, noting the lack of personal touches, the absence of warmth. It was a place where secrets were stored, carefully hidden behind a facade of simplicity. Palmer led them to a small sitting room where he motioned for them to take a seat. Mrs. Winthrop remained standing, her gaze flickering nervously from Palmer to Miss Marple. The tension in the air was thick enough to be cut with a knife. "You've come all this way," Palmer began, his tone even. "And for what? To accuse me of something I didn't do? I don't know what's gotten into you, Miss Marple, but you're barking up the wrong tree." "Am I?" Miss Marple's voice was steady, her eyes never leaving his. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about. The debts. Richard Fairmont." Grace Palmer's face darkened, his fingers tightening around the armrest of his chair. Richard was a fool, a man who gambled with things he didn't understand, and when he couldn't pay up, it fell to me to clean up his mess. Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing. "So, you're the one who forced Richard out. You were the one who made sure he disappeared." Palmer's gaze hardened. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're implying, but I had to make sure he was out of the picture. He was a liability. His disappearance was necessary to protect my investments." "And Grace?" Miss Marple asked. "Why poison her? What did she ever do to you?" For the first time, Palmer looked uncomfortable. His jaw tightened, and he glanced at Mrs. Winthrop, who was standing quietly in the corner. She had been silent throughout the exchange, her expression unreadable, though Miss Marple could sense her internal conflict. "She was part of the equation," Palmer said, his voice low. "I couldn't afford for her to be a threat. She knew too much, but it wasn't supposed to go this far. I only intended to scare her, to make her keep quiet. But someone else took matters into their own hands, someone I wasn't expecting." Miss Marple's mind raced. "Who?" she asked, her voice sharp. Palmer hesitated, his eyes flickering toward Mrs. Winthrop. The truth was slowly unraveling, but it was clear now that Palmer wasn't the only person involved in this. Someone else, someone close to home, had been pulling the strings all along. Finally, Palmer spoke, his voice low. "It wasn't supposed to be like this, but it was Grace's mother, wasn't it? She's the one who arranged it all. I was just the middleman." Mrs. Winthrop gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. "No, that's not true," she cried, her voice trembling. "I didn't." "You didn't?" Miss Marple interrupted, her eyes sharp as a knife. "You didn't help him, Mrs. Winthrop. Didn't you just tell me that you wanted to protect Grace, to keep her away from the truth? I believe you did whatever was necessary to protect her future, no matter the cost." The room fell silent. Mrs. Winthrop stood frozen, her face strained of colour. Palmer's words hung in the air, undeniable and damning. It was clear now that Mrs. Winthrop had been involved, whether she fully understood the consequences or not. In her desperation to protect her daughter, she had crossed a line she could never return from. "I wanted to protect her," Mrs. Winthrop whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I thought if I could just keep her safe, everything would be fine. But I was wrong." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No one is beyond redemption, Mrs. Winthrop. But you must face the consequences of your actions. Grace needs to be found, and the truth must come to light."